Imagine a man who wakes up at 3 in the afternoon, meticulously checks if the seals on his cabinets haven't been tampered with, grabs a walking stick with a concealed blade, and sets off for a stroll, during which he won't utter a single word to anyone he passes. Upon returning, he dines in absolute silence, cursing the noise outside his window, and before sleep slips a loaded pistol beneath his pillow. This is not the description of a criminal on the run. This is the daily life of one of Europe's greatest thinkers. Arthur Schopenhauer, the man who first officially diagnosed the universe with the word hopeless. He is often called the prophet of pessimism, but that is too mild. Schopenhauer was the first Western philosopher who dared to declare that behind the facade of culture, religion and reason hides a blind, hungry, and utterly insane monster he called the will. But here lies the ultimate paradox. The man who preached that life is suffering lived 72 years in total comfort, owning a vast inheritance, attending the finest theatres and savouring exquisite wines. Why did the one who advised humanity to renounce desire never deny himself any pleasure? Was he a hypocrite? Or was his pessimism the only way to shield his fragile, wounded psyche from reality? On Deconstructing Minds, we begin the psychological autopsy of Arthur Schopenhauer. We will examine how his childhood became a battlefield, why he hated women, feared barbers, and why his only true friend in life was a poodle. We are deconstructing a mind that built a fortress out of hatred to prevent the world from seeing just how much he was hurting. To understand Schopenhauer, we must look into his home in Danzig. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was not just a wealthy merchant. He was the embodiment of bourgeois pride. He wanted Arthur to be a man of the world, a socialite, and a successful businessman. But Heinrich suffered from what we would today call severe clinical depression and paranoia. He was obsessed with the fear of ruin, even though he was incredibly wealthy. When Arthur was 17, his father's body was found in the canal behind their house. Officially an accident, but everyone in town knew Heinrich had jumped from a warehouse window. This was the first brick in the foundation of Arthur's pessimism. The suicide of the strongest man in his life proved to him wealth and success are mere masks hiding chaos. But if his father left a void in his soul, his mother, Johanna, filled it with pure poison. Johanna was a woman of a new type, emancipated, vibrant, a future famous novelist. The problem was she was a narcissist who could not stand competition. To her, Arthur was a sullen reminder of a boring husband. Their letters are masterpieces of psychological abuse. Johanna wrote to him, "Your presence oppresses me. Your complaints about the world are unbearable. If you want to be loved, stop being yourself." Arthur responded with cold intellectual rage. Once, during an argument in Weimar, Johanna literally pushed him down the stairs. He stood up, dusted himself off, and spoke the words that became his revenge. "The world will only remember you through me." They did not speak for the last 24 years of her life. This total collapse of attachment to his mother, the most important object in a child's life, gave birth to Schopenhauer's conviction that women are incapable of deep feeling or reason. His infamous essay On Women, where he calls them stunted, narrow-shouldered and wide-hipped creatures, is not philosophy. It is an attempt to intellectually castrate the woman who rejected him. He projected his mother onto half of humanity. After his father's death and the final break with his mother, Arthur was left alone with his colossal ego and a massive inheritance. He saw himself not just as a philosopher, but as a messiah who had come to open humanity's eyes to the truth. In 1820, he arrived at the University of Berlin. This was the moment of his greatest pride and his most crushing defeat. At that time, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel reigned supreme in Berlin. If Nietzsche was a rebel, Hegel was the minister of philosophy, a living god of the academic world. Schopenhauer despised him. He called Hegel a clumsy charlatan and a ministerial lackey whose texts were meaningless gibberish. Arthur committed an act of intellectual kamikaze. He intentionally scheduled his lectures at the exact same hours as Hegel. This wasn't just a scheduling conflict. It was a psychological projection. Schopenhauer wanted to prove that the true genius, himself, would defeat the false idol, Hegel. He expected crowds of students to desert Hegel's hall and run to him. Reality was merciless. Hundreds came to Hegel. 5 showed up for Schopenhauer. Within a semester, he was left alone in an empty hall. This was a severe narcissistic injury. The world had rejected him just as his mother once had. But instead of admitting defeat or changing his approach, Schopenhauer made a classic defensive maneuver. He decided that it wasn't him who was at fault, but that the world was too stupid to understand him. He left the universities forever, calling professors sophists on a payroll. This failure permanently cemented his misanthropy. From this point on, the crowd was nothing but an irrational herd to him, and his solitude became a badge of honor. He turned his exile into a cult. If you were to enter his apartment in Frankfurt, you wouldn't see a sage's study, but a paranoid's bunker. Schopenhauer pushed caution to the level of a mental disorder. A psychoanalysis of his daily life reveals a man living in constant expectation of an attack. He never trusted a barber to shave his throat. He feared a stranger would slit his carotid artery. He hid bonds and gold in the most unexpected places and disguised his manuscripts as household bills so that thieves wouldn't steal his priceless thoughts. He carried his own glass to restaurants because he was obsessed with the fear of catching infections from the filthy masses. When he slept, a loaded pistol and a sword always lay beside his bed. Why did a philosopher who taught that death is a release cling so desperately to safety? Here lies the key conflict of his personality. His will is an insatiable monster that demands life. Schopenhauer the thinker despised life, but Schopenhauer the man was a slave to his biological anxiety. His paranoia was the external manifestation of his philosophy. He saw the world not as a community of people, but as an arena where every being is a predator. Any noise behind the door, any suspicious glance from a passer-by confirmed his theory. The world is hostile. He lived in a state of besieged fortress. His isolation was not a voluntary retreat toward wisdom. It was an attempt to build a war between himself and the blind will of other people, who, he believed, were only waiting for the moment to destroy him. At the very heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy lies a concept that predated Freud's ideas about the id by an entire century. It is the will. But do not confuse it with willpower or determination. For Arthur, the will is an impersonal, unconscious, eternally hungry monster that forms the bedrock of all existence. Psychoanalytically, Schopenhauer's will is a projection of his own chronic dissatisfaction. He saw us as puppets. We think we are choosing our partners, careers, or goals, but in reality we are driven by this blind instinct. And here Schopenhauer delivers his most famous sentence. Life is a pendulum that swings between suffering and boredom. When we want something, we suffer from its absence. When we attain it, we are hit by instant satiation and suffocating boredom. And the pendulum swings back. Why is this crucial for deconstructing his personality? Because Schopenhauer, despite being incredibly wealthy and free, never felt full. He possessed everything his father had dreamed of, yet that monster of the will never stopped howling inside him. His philosophy is an attempt to explain to himself why having money, food, and status doesn't bring happiness. He blamed the structure of the universe so he wouldn't have to admit that the problem lay in his own ability to feel joy. Schopenhauer was the first to strip the romantic mask from love and replace it with a biological blueprint. His chapter, The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, is perhaps the most cynical text of the 19th century. He argued that love is an illusion, the genius of the species, deceiving us into bringing the next generation of sufferers into the world. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this cynicism is a classic defense mechanism. Remember his mother, who pushed him down the stairs. Remember his failed attempts at relationships. Schopenhauer feared intimacy. For him, getting close to another human being meant risking rejection, pain, or humiliation. If you declare love to be a biological trap, you no longer have to admit that you are simply hurting from being alone. It was his way of maintaining intellectual superiority. I am not lonely because no one loves me. I am lonely because I have unmasked nature's deception and refused to participate. He viewed attraction as a temporary madness of the mind. His rejection of marriage and family was not asceticism, but an act of total distrust toward human closeness, born from the primal trauma with his mother. Toward the end of his life, Schopenhauer attained what he had long awaited: fame. The world had finally grown tired of optimism and turned to his pessimism. But did this success make him kinder? No. He still dined alone at the English hotel in Frankfurt, placing a gold coin on the table before his meal. He promised to give it to the poor if he heard a single intelligent thought from the officers at the next table. The coin always returned to his pocket. The only being allowed into his heart was a poodle. He named his dogs Atman, Sanskrit for higher self, or Butts. Schopenhauer seriously claimed that there is more truth in the eyes of an animal than in all the books of philosophers. Why? Because a dog cannot lie. It is a pure manifestation of the will, devoid of human treachery and narcissism. In his love for dogs, we see the profound despair of a man who had completely given up on his own species. He bequeathed part of his inheritance to the care of his dog and to animal charities. When he died in 1860 on his sofa, there were no friends or relatives in the room, only silence and the echo of his philosophy. He had proven his theory: life is isolation. But in that isolation, he found a peculiar peace, becoming the Buddha of Frankfurt, a man who stopped expecting love from people and began to simply watch their vanity from the window of his fortress.